And as far as Russia is concerned, they have eschewed communism. They made it. I mean, Putin himself has said that he has zero interest in bringing back communism or even the Soviet Union.
Hello and welcome to A Questioning Mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and today I'm joined by Menon. Jay has been a political analyst. He is a contributing author to Swarajya. He is the admin of a defense website, and I've had the pleasure of co-authoring an article in Swarajya recently about the German energy crisis. And I'll be discussing today with him the global geopolitical scenario and how it's expected to play out in the near future. So Jay, very welcome to the show. Thanks so much for making the time. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you, Sagarika, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm glad to be here. Can you hear me clearly now?
Sure, Jay. It's very nice to have you and for you to make the time today. So like we wrote this article, and I think it got quite a lot of traction from several commentators who've read it. And you had a lot of thoughts on how the German energy crisis has been in play for. It's something that Germany and Europe could have seen coming years ago. So let's begin there, and we'll segue into the larger global picture in a while.
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is something that not just Germany, but I would say mainland Europe should have seen coming, because the pieces were falling into place for some time now. I had written as long back as 2015 in Swarajya that Germany was making a huge strategic mistake by getting invested, not just Germany, all of the European Union, by getting invested in this situation in the Ukraine. That Ukraine was going to be a frontline state that is going to become troublesome was evident to anybody who has been watching the situation since the 2000s, by which time the Russians had already started saying there are red lines and there are red lines. Now by then they had already expanded. NATO had already expanded into the Eastern European members and the Baltics as well, but not much was made of it. Perhaps more should have been, but not much was. But they made it clear at the same time that the red lines of Georgia and Ukraine were, like I said, there are red lines and there are red lines. These were the final, so to speak, red lines. And it was evident in Georgia. I think it was in 2008, a little bit after 2008, 2009, after the Security Conference in Munich, when the Russians moved into Georgia to put an end to an American and NATO-inspired, let's call it that, instability with the former president, Shalikashvili Mikhail, who incidentally moved on to Ukraine. He was a Georgian. He moved on to Ukraine and was, I think, governor of Odessa for some time. And he also has an American passport. This is the man in Georgia. Now, after that, it should have been even clearer that any move to sort of integrate NATO into Ukraine, integrate Ukraine into NATO would have consequences of some kind. Now, would everybody have foreseen a war or a special military operation, as the Russians call it? Not necessarily. But, when you trip a red line, something is bound to happen. And they should have seen this coming, because you had the first situation in 2014 when the Maidan events, which are essentially a coup against what was then an elected government, occurred, again with American diplomats in the thick of it, literally discussing who should be the next government, etc., etc., and organizing it for the most part. Much of it is on video, actually, remarkably.
Yes.
So, but it is there, and you can actually listen to the discussions and so on. So at that point, the Europeans should have taken a stand, and they did, actually. Germany and France, with Ukraine and Russia, negotiated Minsk II. Minsk II, if it was implemented, we would not be seeing this war now. But it wasn't implemented. And it can be argued that it was not implemented because it wasn't implemented because the Ukrainian far right threatened Zelensky that if he did implement it, he would lose his head, basically. The question can also be asked: who advised or who pushed the far right to make that claim? They probably didn't need the pushing, but they needed confidence, because if that push was not, if that threat was not made with sufficient confidence, in other words, they should have had the backing of somebody to make that threat. And if the argument is that the far right is and the neo-Nazis are very limited in Ukraine, what's the reason for that confidence? You see? So obviously, there's a lot of things happening in the background, which is invisible to most of us, but you can only speculate. So this is essentially speculation. But we do know that the Minsk II was not implemented. And after that, you've had a consistent bombardment of the Donbass from the Ukrainian side, which has cost around 14,000 lives between 2014 and 2022.
This is something that, I'd like for you to elaborate on a little bit about the realities of Donbass and the ethnicity of the people there and what they've gone through and how long they've had to go through it.
Okay, so there's a lot of material on the net, but I can just give you as good an overview as possible verbally. Basically, Ukraine is divided into two segments, one of which is, let's say, NATO facing, westward facing, and one which is Russia facing, which consists mainly of ethnic Russians who identify themselves as ethnic Russians for the larger part. Crimea, for instance, is almost 95% plus ethnic Russian people, which is why the takeover of Crimea was so quick and so smooth, because they essentially went in without arms. Pretty much the same applies in the Luhansk and Donetsk republics. So you can say roughly up to the Dnieper River, which is a little bit further west of the republics, we are talking about an ethnic Russian majority, a substantial ethnic Russian majority. And on the other side, you have what is regarded as an ethnic Ukrainian majority. However, there are claims to those areas by Poland going back beyond, before World War II, etc., Galicia region, and the Transcarpathian region also from the Hungarian side. So we are going back now to pre-World War, even pre-World War I configurations of states in those areas. So those are the memories being dredged up now as a consequence of this situation. But they were in effect dredged up from 2014 itself because of the bombarding of the Donbass by the Ukrainian forces, which were in this same period being trained by NATO to the level of interoperability, which means basically that NATO units could operate together with the Ukrainian units in a manner that is make them indistinguishable from each other in terms of their operational skill sets. So that was going on. So a lot of work was being done in Ukraine to integrate them into NATO, while the claims were made as early as 2008 that they would integrate Ukraine into NATO. So like I said, the tripwire had already been passed in 2008 pretty much. In 2014, we had this the actions against Donbass starting with the coup in this thing in Kiev, or Kyiv as the Ukrainians call it, and the consequences. What happened in February 2022, February 24, which is the invasion of Russian forces, the incursion of Russian forces, the invasion of Russian forces into Ukraine. But prior to that, already there had been a stepping up of action across the border by the Ukrainian side, which is recorded by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. They had, as observers, they had noted it, that this is happening, So it's, I mean, if the idea is that on the morning of February 24th, Putin woke up and decided, let me invade Ukraine, that doesn't hold water at all. I mean, if people have been predicting since the early 2000, from 2008, as a matter of fact, that this is going to happen, there are enough credible people saying this. John Mearsheimer, for example, professor at the University of Chicago, is just one example. There are others. Another professor who's passed away, his name is Stephen Kotkin, I think. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's Stephen Kotkin, who also took the same position, basically. Stephen Cohen, not Kotkin. Stephen Kotkin is another one. This is Stephen Cohen. Had said the same thing. So it was obvious. But these moves were made with some intent. And that intent was described actually by a couple of RAND studies, which said that the intention was to overextend and create imbalance in Russia. And of course, US Treasury Secretary said they want to weaken Russia, basically for the foreseeable future. The Russians, of course, see this as an existential problem, which means they fear that they're going to be cut up into pieces and basically chewed apart by the NATO for resources, and then as a launch pad against China.
Right.
Which is why China is quite happy to support the Russians today. Right. They see it too.
That is true. So the Russia-China partnership as such is definitely not based on the communist West of Russia and the current communist regime in China. So that's something that is being made a matter of ideology rather than geopolitics today. So
I think, yeah, the ideological part of it is really opportunistic. I don't think that either part is actually communist in the ideological sense anymore.
right,
The
absolutely.
CCP, the CCP
But then
uses
no
the.
communist nation typically is.
That's true. True. I mean, it's one thing to have the ideal in mind, but what actually unfolds is rather different. The CCP is basically has all the trappings of communism, the symbolism, and all the rest of it, including the language. But in fact, it is more capitalist than pretty much anybody else. And as far as Russia is concerned, they have eschewed communism. They made it. I mean, Putin himself has said that he has zero interest in bringing back communism or even the Soviet Union. I mean, a lot of people say that he has, they quote him as saying that the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed is a tragedy. But he also said subsequently that, I mean, in the same discourse, that anybody who wants to get this, someone who doesn't want the Soviet Union back has no heart, but someone who does has no brain. So, I mean, he's very clear about his position in this. The problem really on the ground is that it's very difficult to argue that the Russians are acting irrationally. It could have been made, they tried, that argument was tried, but it's not flying. Neither is it flying in among the publics in Europe, especially continental Europe, nor is it flying anywhere else. I mean, forget about Asia. Nobody in Asia buys this. It's obvious from the reaction. No one is actually paying any attention to the sanctions regime, first of all.
Right. Well, Europe itself has not paid a lot of attention to their own sanctions and are now officially diluting them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Even Europe itself, actually, is as you said, making the right noises, but doing the wrong actions, so to speak. They speak very much in favor of sanctions and this and that and the other thing. But I'm hearing every day that one or the other has been diluted simply for the purpose of necessary commerce necessary for energy, for food, etc., etc. So I don't think that this situation is going to benefit ultimately the organization NATO, nor the organization European Union, because all it has done is it has highlighted the fissures that exist between them, primarily mental ones, but now they're becoming real because people are really being affected on the ground in their personal day-to-day lives.
Well, that's true. But like we discussed, the energy crisis in Germany has reached, I think, levels unprecedented since probably World War II.
Yeah.
At this time, with heating being switched off, and it's only July, winter's yet to hit, and these are the common people who are known to have a very high quality of life. They're very used to a high quality of life with their energy being subsidized by Russia, their military capabilities being subsidized by NATO for so long. So they did have a very comfortable arrangement until now. So I think the shutdown of the nuclear plants is something we also wrote about. And I believe that what we did not get into was the history of, this energy, this manufactured energy crisis, which essentially leaves them dependent on either the US, which cannot provide them enough energy for themselves because it just it stopped domestic production, and or Russia, which they're going back to right now. So, or trying to go back to bypassing sanctions some way. So, if you could, let the viewers have an idea of how this nuclear energy, played into this, and how the Fukushima disaster affected ideas about nuclear energy in Europe and other countries that have gone that way. Do we expect this to continue, or do we expect flip of ideas and mainstream thinking around nuclear power?
Okay, so I'll answer this as first focusing on Germany situation, the German situation precisely, and then we will talk about Fukushima and the general impact of the environmental movement and so on and so forth, and what's likely to happen. So the German situation, I mean, it's rather peculiar because if you look at the outcome of the sanctions, one might think that the sanctions were directed not against Russia but against Germany, because the highest, the impact of the thing is actually being, I think, greatest, and the potential also for the greatest damage lies in it looks that it might be on Germany. The greatest damage might be done to Germany's trading story, which it has developed with really tremendous effort and tremendous success after World War II. I mean, look, the Germans, I mean, this is what a lot of people don't understand. The Germans were a different country after the end of World War II. They have accepted their the role that they had. They have atoned for it. They have taught their children to atone for it. And there is no German that you meet today who is not in some way, who is not informed about the past. Everybody is, who is not reflexively
Unlike the
apologetic.
British, you mean?
Correct. And unlike the British, let's leave the British aside on this question and talk about the Germans. These guys, Germans have done the right things. They've educated their children. They've told them about the past. They've learned the lessons from whatever what they have experienced and what they have done, really, and turned around. Now, if you talk to the Germans, they just want people around them, the countries around them, to be their friends, basically, and the world. That's how they present themselves, as a leading technological force for trade, who is interested in basically enhancing their arts and culture through a European identity. They like the European identity. That was the situation. Now, though, they have found themselves really at the receiving end of these sanctions, which they themselves have adopted. Remember, this whole sanctions business is voluntary. There's no legal imprint on it. There's no UN or anybody else saying this should be done. This is just a voluntary move. And who has been hit the most, if you ask me, is Germany. The Russians are doing fine. The ruble is strong. Inflation is broadly under control, though it's kind of gone up. And the projected contraction of the economy has come down from what they said was about 15 or 20% to now about 5%. Projections, of course. All of these are projections. But nevertheless, the impact of the sanctions on Russia seems less than the impact on Germany, where you're seeing rather drastic numbers. And of course, if the energy is shut off, which they have a taste of now that Nord Stream 1 is closed for a few, it's comprehensive disaster for the trading story, because Germany is essentially a trading nation, over $1 trillion in exports. How will they do it if they don't have oil and gas? The key point here is Germany needs about 155 billion cubic meters of gas every year. Now, the Russians are the primary providers. Nobody can replace it. At the moment, from what the Americans have said, my memory is right, they've said they can supply somehow about 15 billion cubic meters, 1.5. And I've heard that they've made an agreement with Qatar, which for about 20. That's 35. This is also for the future. They're not talking about immediately. Neither of them can do it immediately because the infrastructure doesn't exist. So what are they going to do this winter and next winter? Forget about the heating. Leave aside the heating. Let's say they manage somehow of the homes and so on. But what about industry, which cannot survive without oil and gas? It's going to be severely debilitated. I don't think that this is going to happen. I think there's going to be some sort of a policy change that will be affected in the coming months, and we will see Germany taking a stance. Until now, Germany really hasn't taken a stance. All they have done is they've said they're going to double their defense expenditure, which is a good thing. They need to do it because really they cannot be dependent entirely on the support or the security provided by outside forces. That's the clearest lesson I think that Germany has learned. The second one is that they have to move away from having a primary overwhelming supplier of energy like Russia is. And at the same time, Germany is right there in the Central European heartland. You cannot wish away Russia. Russia is always going to be there. What do you plan to do with it? It's easier for America.
Russia did want to join NATO themselves, right?
Correct. Those sounds were made, NATO, European Union, and they were brushed off as non-serious propositions. Why they were considered non-serious is a different story, but that's basically what happened. So the Russians have been, and they feel sort of ostracized.
Absolutely.
And there's a certain sense of victimhood that they feel as a consequence of that. And when you put this on top of the NATO encroaching into Ukraine, the whole thing becomes existential. And that's what has happened. And they have reacted in a way that is consistent with their general historical approach to such things. Let's put it like that. And also, it's important to remember that Russia really hasn't attacked anybody in Europe ever. Unless we go back a few hundred years. But in the last year alone, the last 150 years alone, we had Napoleon, the French, we had the Germans twice, So there is a history that they can look behind and feel there's reason to feel concerned about it. That's one thing. And then on the other hand, you had 25 to 30 million Russians dying in World War II. That's a huge number, 25 to 30 million people of one country. That's next only to the Indians. That's the next were the Indians. We lost 3 million fighting quasi-voluntarily, let's say, on behalf of the British. But 3 million Indians died as well. Let's not forget that. But the next, the highest, obviously, were the Russians, between 25 and 30, including civilians and everything. But still, that's big number. And they haven't forgotten it. For Russia, this is lived history every year. They have ceremonies across all their oblasts, their provinces, to remember this date, and it's a very serious, important historical event for them. So that's what they see when NATO encroaches. So, like I said, nobody can say that this was an unprovoked aggression. I mean, you can argue the case, but it won't hold any water anywhere. And that's why you see the entire world not responding in the same way as they did, for example, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, which was
Right.
entirely, as far as history is concerned, it was limited. I mean, you cannot take any example and say there was a particular provocation here. This has been going on for the past 20 odd years, if not more. So that's why you don't see such consensus. It is clear that something isn't right here. The publics are aware of it. I mean, they can sense it as well, not just in Europe, in the US as well. You see a lot of opposition to this constant supply of weapons to Ukraine, for example. There are any number of
dollars of taxpayer money has been funneled into Ukraine.
Exactly. The fact that the economies are not doing well has something to do with it. But I think people are able to see through the mass media, the corporate media narrative, because it just doesn't hold water. It doesn't make sense, and that's why where we are at now. And I think the same situation is going to result in Germany taking a stand that is, let's put it like this, slightly deviant from the one that is taken now. At least slightly deviant. It's probably going to be more. It would have to be.
So do you expect them to restart their nuclear power plants? Because that may not happen. They may, because they've restarted coal power
Correct.
plants.
Exactly.
And,
this is the second. Sorry. Yeah. Continue.
Or are they going back to Russian oil now? Russian gas now?
Two things. One is
going to increase their intake of Russian oil and gas.
Okay. Two things. One, of course, shutting down the nuclear plants is just a purely political, senseless decision, because of all the energies that is currently available, apart from the renewables, nuclear is the cleanest. It's just that nobody is willing to say it out because it's got a bad rap after Fukushima, and of course there's Chernobyl and all the stuff. But basically that's an emotional perspective. And from a practical point of view, there are so many nuclear plants running all around the world, providing electricity to millions of people. I mean, France is an example, right next door, basically. So I think that eventually...
France has also decommissioned several of its nuclear power plants, though.
It had, but I mean, it is a huge source of energy for France, nuclear power plants. I mean, it's not going to...
I think 70% of them.
Yeah, something like that. And I don't foresee a situation where, especially now, that France is going to go back on that. I expect that now that the Germans, have decided to bring back coal, which is about as dirty as you can get, it would be very hard for them to make a case that you shouldn't do nuclear. I think they will go back eventually to nuclear. They'll make every effort to reduce their dependency on Russia. But here's the problem. They can do whatever they want. But in the interim, at least for the next decade, I think, if not more, they will be dependent on some supplies from Russia. There's no getting around this simple reality. Unless they're willing to pay much, much more for it coming from the United States. Which then begs the question, what is the logic of having your entire military security as well as your energy security vested in one particular country? It defeats the entire argument of diversity of supply. Yeah. And also begs the question, what exactly are you going to have as a relationship with Russia, which is just sitting right there, right next door? It makes zero sense. Exactly, the whole construct of what we are seeing now makes very, very little sense. It should have been the case.
Sorry, since you said next door and brought the relationship that the Germans will have with Russia going forward, and you've also said that the Russians did feel provoked in this case. Now, going forward, this is just speculation again, extreme speculation. Now, if Germany were to continue to ally with USA and get even more dependent on them, as they are currently on the road to doing, do you see Russia as an expansionist force? And because there's not going to, I'm not sure that if they can, as a country, bear this burden of war again, but do you see Russia reacting with war against Germany going forward?
No. I don't see, certainly not against Germany. Look, the Russians don't want to have antagonistic relationships with anybody at this point. And there was no evidence that they wanted to begin with. Yes. That's the whole point. I mean, people keep talking about Russia as an expansionist power, but where has it expanded since 1991? The only place where the issue arose, where its military went in, was in Georgia, because of obvious reasons which I described earlier. And this is the reason, the same reason, basically identically in Ukraine as well. I don't see the Russians expanding and taking over other countries or invading other countries. Certainly not Germany. You know, in the near future or anything like this, unless we have a situation of all-out war between NATO and Russia directly. In which case, all the cards are on the table, and we could be talking about an absolute nuclear catastrophe that is of global scale. I don't see that either at the moment, which explains, I don't know, which is not which explains, which yeah, you could say explains, which explains the reticence of NATO to get directly involved in Ukraine. I mean, so far they've kept up the fiction that they are only providing weapons. Although we all know that there were and probably still are NATO advisors who have been out of staff or out of uniform, basically, under the guise of anything from mercenaries to Red Cross, humanitarian NGOs, whatever. This is for sure. There are plenty of people in country in Ukraine, but not officially as NATO military men. Some might be there, and there are reports that some have been captured, etc., etc. But this is all speculation. We don't know. There is a strong sense that they should stay out of Ukraine in a military sense, direct military confrontation. And that's primarily because once that happens, you really can't tell where it will end, And here is another important point which never mentioned, which is rarely mentioned, I should say. The real victim again is continental Europe, because the United States is an ocean away, and Britain is a channel away. So all the direct confrontation which will happen, if it does happen, is going to spill over into countries which have borders with the Ukraine. And that's where we are talking about Poland, Germany. I mean, Germany doesn't have a border, but very, very close. And the rest. I mean, think of the weapons that have been supplied into Ukraine now.
I was going to mention that. Yes.
Correct. Think of the weapons that have been supplied into Ukraine now. Should the war seem to be going downhill, which already it is from the Ukrainian point of view, if you're going to be reasonably objective about it, the Russians have taken about maybe 20 to 25, maybe upwards of 25% of the territory. Okay. Imagine the Ukrainian soldiers who end up with all these weapons saying, look, I can probably make more money out of it, selling it, maybe even to the Russians, and then just hot-footing it out of here to some other country, than actually using it against them, understanding the risk of being identified and being killed. And there are enough videos floating out there which suggest that this is actually happening, and there are sales opportunities for javelins and NLAWs on the darknet for $30,000 and things like this. God knows how far all this is true, because anybody can put up anything, but it's very clear that this is a possibility. And the problem is that these things can leak right back into Europe. I mean, billions of dollars of weapons have gone there. These can easily leak back into Europe. The Ukrainians themselves could take it back. It's extremely dangerous and extremely reckless, if you ask me. Series of actions since the early 2000s. Excuse me.
Right. So now the weapons have already, made their appearance felt in the rest of Europe, and perhaps this war will hopefully end sooner rather than later, and we don't see them being deployed internally within Europe anytime soon. However, like it's said, war is one of the best opportunities for profiteers and new.
Of course. I mean, the whole thing. A cynic might say that the whole thing is basically an American restocking exercise.
Absolutely.
The money that the Americans pay for this, the 60 billion or so. I think the initial request was for 40 billion. Then it magically transformed into 60 billion. Probably because the congressman said, look, I mean, if we are going to send weapons and we are going to deploy money for it, then obviously my constituents have to benefit as well. So what happens? What is in stock in the United States inventory is shipped out, and what is shipped out is restocked. For that restocking, the money goes from the government account to a military supplier account. Yeah, contractor account, military contractor supplier account. Raytheons and Lockheed Martins and all the rest of these who produce these things. I mean, the money doesn't really leave the U.S. except for a little, as an insignificant part really for the trainings and all the rest of it. But most of it is just transferred internally in the U.S. The weapons are inventoried, they're shipped out, and the empty warehouses, and then just restocked. That's why I said it's cynic might say that this is just a restocking exercise. And the real tragedy of all this is that the ordinary Ukrainian, who neither had a say in the policy that their own leaders took, nor had any idea of what was coming to them, are now being asked to die on behalf of the state. and they are dying in their tens of thousands. And people, the estimate that I heard this morning actually is around 50,000 dead. That's 50,000 soldiers. We're talking about the soldiers now. Forget about the remaining civilians and so on. Yeah, it's really an immoral, unconscionable situation, and well, it is what it is. Let's just hope it ends soon.
Right. Well, since again you mentioned this, Ukraine has been in the grip of instability for a very, very long time. For ever since it became Ukraine, even before then, the citizens themselves, the civilians, have seen a lot of instability. And even today, there's a lot of non-mainstream news about how civilians are killed by the Azov troops themselves.
Yeah,
They're tortured.
yeah,
They're forced to um, support them, or otherwise just generally victims. Even the Romas, especially a minority people living there, there's videos of them being tortured by Nazi troops. So this is not something that's discussed in the mainstream media, and it's also something that was reflected in the call for investigation into the Bucha massacres, which Russia supported, but others did not, which should be surprising, but it's not been discussed enough.
correct. I mean, you're right. It hasn't been discussed enough because much of it is really sensitive and speculative. All we know is that it's the far right groups in Ukraine. There are several of them. I mean, there is the Azov Battalion, there is the Right Sector, there is the Misanthropic Division, and there is Centuria. You name it. There are many of these little fragmentary groups. Most of them are inspired and draw upon Nazi symbology, and a lot of the literature is very much in that vein. However, they don't have the organizational structure or anything like that the actual Nazis had.
Right.
So we can call them neo-Nazis, but essentially they're just a grouping of several, or just a consortium of several far-right groups that don't necessarily even agree among themselves on principles and practices and so on. But they generally go towards the general common interest direction, which is basically that it's a racist, anti-Semitic, and very, very prone to violence. So, and they have been trained, by the way, in these past 8 years. Among the people trained by the NATO forces, include people from these groups. And there is in fact a Georgetown University study through its IERES institute, I think, which actually focuses on the particular group called Centuria. There are photographs and everything. I mean, it's very clear. I mean, this was done in 2021, well before this started. So, yeah, the far right groups in Ukraine they're not small, and this is the key point. I mean, people say that this is very insignificant. It's not. There's a lot of sympathy for these people, and one of these, Oleg Tanibok, he's actually a politician, and he's one of these guys. He's one of these neo-Nazi people, and there's even a photograph of U.S. officials shaking his hand. So these are not unknown things. Like I said, it's hard to understand how this came to be in the US. I mean, how did they start supporting these people and why? That's the part that is hard, actually, from an analytical point of view, to understand or to look at in detail without coming to the conclusion that there's something deeply wrong in the US policy-making establishment. And I wouldn't blame all of the US for this, but there is certain group or certain segment of this the security enclave in the US, which includes the State Department, that has allowed this to happen, and it shouldn't have, because now we're really on the cusp of something that could become totally tragic for the whole world, not just for. I mean, it's already tragic enough. It could become much more, and it's very hard to understand how this could have happened, because the Americans, they're not a malevolent power. They're not benevolent, but they're not malevolent either. They just do what's in their interest. What I don't understand is how did they come to this pass where they thought that this was in their interest, to damage the economic prospects of continental Europe, to damage their own image, their own credibility worldwide. I mean, when you close off SWIFT, when you confiscate bank accounts of wealthy individuals, when you confiscate their assets, you're telling something to the world. You're telling the world that we will do whatever we like with your savings, with your whatever, your investments. And that doesn't add to a country's credibility. People are already, finding ways to move away from the dollar.
Especially as a democracy.
Correct. Especially as a democracy. And this is the part that is hard to understand. How did this come to be? How did this come to be in the US? I cannot understand it, in the sense, without saying that there is a certain, how shall we call it, destructive impulse that is emerging out of the US. For some reason that is only they know, and only they can change through elections. But for the moment, the rest of the world has to deal with it. That's what we're facing now.
Speaking of the US, do you expect their domestic oil production to go up? Then
Again,
compared with the environmental green energy goals.
exactly. This is both comical and somehow crazy, because they have all the oil that they need. They could easily ramp up production, bring prices down, and be in a better situation, even strategically. But they can't do it because they're elected on a position that they won't do it. And so Biden's hands are tied in that sense. And I think they will pay a heavy price for this. Electorally speaking, the Democrats will pay a heavy price for this, not just in the elections that are coming in the midterms. They will pay for it in the forthcoming, the next presidential elections as well. It has been just a total catastrophe as far as sane policy direction is concerned. No adults in the room, it seems, in the US at the moment. It's tragic.
It's interesting that they do go to the Middle East to ask for oil. They thought of, doing away with the embargoes in Venezuela. They've been approaching other countries to help their inflation, and they haven't received the help that they expected. And this does showcase a very changed outlook towards the US. And it's not just in the Middle East, not just India, but we can also look at Hungary and Serbia, how they haven't been, and even Turkey to an extent, where they haven't really abided by the sanctions, by any of the resolutions raised in the UN as well. They're not really playing with the team, with NATO as one, and the EU being completely under US control as such.
Correct. I mean, first of all, the distancing of the US from the Middle East, when we say the Middle East, we are at this point talking about the Gulf, which is to say primarily Saudi Arabia, was itself wrong. Okay, whatever happened, etc., there was no need for these dramatic statements that were made by President Biden, which resulted in a very nasty, a very negative atmosphere between these countries, which have been allies for more than half a century, close allies. Why do it? And then you have to come to a situation where you say you will not shake the hands of the future king of Saudi Arabia, who's very important in this world, and who's doing a lot of right things, by the way, in Saudi Arabia. Another thing that people don't understand is that the Gulf countries are being positively transformed in a tremendous way. Unless you are able to, you observe it closely, or you observe it on a daily basis, you don't understand, you are not able to appreciate it. People have an impression that the Gulf countries are in a particular way, but that's not the case anymore. Saudi Arabia itself has changed so dramatically in the last few years. It's incredible, and they're going in the right direction. They're doing all the things that the West at one time had been asking them to do. Not only that, not only are they doing it, they're doing it faster than one would have expected. The UAE has become one of the most enlightened, is the right word I think I would use, places to live and work. There is security and safety, for instance, for people. There are 130 plus nationalities there. There is hardly any crime, and I'm talking about violent crime and all this stuff. White collar crimes and so on, I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about just violent, socially destabilizing crimes. Literally zero, and the work ethics and things like this are evolving with the times. They're very flexible. COVID was handled in an amazing way by generally pretty much all the Gulf countries, but in particular the UAE. The UAE is a standard. It's an exemplary state at this point, no question about it. For somebody who can observe this on a day-to-day basis, for instance, even if you're outside the country, they should be able to recognize this very, very quickly, because it's going in absolutely the right direction. And let's look at the other little development that has happened that has got no publicity. Why? And this is amazing. During the Trump regime, we had the Abraham Accords, which is such a tremendous success. That it would have been, it should have been a huge song and dance over it. But because it was Trump, it was just exactly. But just because it was Trump, it was maybe a 2-day story, 3-day story. That was it. But in fact, Israel and the UAE have a warm peace, and it was a deliberate war. They've deliberately said that they'll have a warm peace, and they're very closely working together, and it's a good thing to see. And now it looks it's the same direction. They're going in the same direction vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, which is also doing similar things. Recently, they allowed direct flights into Saudi Arabia, which is this is all good for the region. It reassures the world that there are sane people at the helm, And that has been the case for the last couple of decades, as a matter of fact. The problem is most of us are reading and exposed to the corporate media, mainstream media, and what you see there is, by and large, very far from the truth. Very far from anything like objective reality. Very far. And it's tragic, because that it actually means that democracy is being undermined within itself by the people who sing the songs of democracy. On the one hand, it's quite tragic, but it's true. I mean, if you want to really get news today, it really is a smorgasbord of stuff where you just pick and choose and hope that you're right, you're picking the right things, because definitely mainstream media doesn't provide it. Thank God for influencers and people who run their own channels.
Thank you. But no, that is something that has been decried often. Interestingly, by big media, by mainstream media, they'll come up with safety valve articles and videos where they mention this, that information, and then they call it disinformation, whereas they might be some of the most egregious in terms of spreading this sort of misinformation and disinformation. Mostly because a lot of these data points may actually be accurate. It's just that they are provided without any context whatsoever. There is no, when comparison is required, they are not provided with comparison. And when it is not required, it is compared to something completely irrelevant. And
Correct.
most people, because the regular citizen cannot be expected to analyze too much, with their everyday livelihood at stake. People do look for easy to consume information, and that is, it's almost in a sense entertainment. Secondhand feelings are provided as dopamine hits today, so it's become pretty difficult for somebody to understand the issue. But now that you mentioned the Abrahamic Accords, and I remember how Abrahamic Accords, sorry, I remember how quickly it disappeared from the news cycle, and today. Do you see the I2U2 as a sort of spillover effect of the Abrahamic Accords?
Not so much as a spillover effect, but a consequence, I would say. I mean, it's likely that it would have happened anyway, right? But it has been facilitated well because of the fact that UAE and Israel has direct relations and a good, warm relationship. Very important. The warmth in the relationship is important because, for example, you take the Egyptian-Israeli relationship is slightly colder. There isn't any real people-to-people engagement.
It's transactional.
Correct. Much more transactional, much more cool. The UAE-Israeli relationship, hitherto, so far anyway, is and I think it will be the case, is a warm one. There is a lot of people-to-people engagement and deliberate. It is clear that this is a state-driven thing because it has to be. After being apart on the basis of various suspicions for centuries or whatever now, you can't overnight have a warm people-to-people relationship. It has to be driven by the state, and it is driven by the state, and it is working well. So that's exactly what we need. So that it has facilitated the I2U2. Now, what does this mean? I mean, the way I see it is, it's very clear that at the end of the day, that this is something that is being built as a segment of the bamboo wall, let's call it, with an eye on China. So you have India, the UAE, Israel, eventually Greece, and then maybe France. Okay, that relationship is being slowly gaining flesh on the bone. There's a developing relationship between the UAE and Greece. India and Greece have just enhanced their relationship over the last couple of years. So this I2U2, then we might see plus I2U2 plus G plus F, and then adding up, sort of like the Quad, because people have been calling it the Eastern Quad. It's sort of like the Quad, without any sort of military intention or something like this, but a convergence of interests that include strategic and commercial, which might eventually evolve into something more substantial in terms of security cooperation and so on and so forth. But at the moment, this is what we're seeing. And the fact remains that India has a fantastic relationship with the UAE, an amazingly close relationship. Similarly close relationship with Israel. And going further to the west, a very close relationship with the island of Cyprus, which is connected to Greece, and then connected to Greece in the identity sense, and of course ultimately to Greece and then possibly France. This will, in this arc, let's say, will sort of stand as a how shall we put this? Stand as something that is a structure that will at some point be useful against the similar structure that's arising from China, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey. You get me? So there is
Yeah.
that arc that way. So there's this arc this way, kind of thing. That will sort of stand in counterpoise, let's say, if necessary. But at the moment, I don't see that. It's not like, it's like the Quad, a group of countries with convergent interests that will act together when the interests of on a case by case basis where the interests converge, and otherwise one will beg out of that particular action, and so on, and it will evolve gradually. These things take time.
Sure. Um, from backing Pakistan and financing terror in India, going to very warm relations, trade relations, people to people relations, how do you see this move towards the Middle East? The journey of India's move towards
Oh,
the UAE and Saudi Arabia happening.
yeah. This is one of the most important
Was it
developments
very
which.
rapid, though? Do you
No,
see that it was very rapid, or do you see it having progressed
no,
over
and
time?
no. It has been something that has progressed over time, and even from the time, I would say, at least not on the political side, but on the defense side,
Yes.
before the Modi 2014 government. So the cooperation started because just there's the convergence of interest, and I believe, and I'm not, you cannot, don't pin me down on it, but I believe that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US began a completely different view of its relationship with India, and thought of it as possible partner in this whole area on the Arabian Sea and the African seaboards. So from that point on, the discussion started about, how do we enhance, or how do we become a provider of net security, including in the Gulf. Obviously, this means talking to the Gulf regimes and then developing a gradual relationship of trust on the defense side and so on. This already started, I would say, in the 2000s. So engagements have already started. What has happened with the Modi government coming to power in 2014 is that the political relationship on the country to country side has become enhanced beyond recognition. Remember that before Modi, the last prime minister to visit the Gulf countries was Indira Gandhi. Okay, so that's a long time we're talking about.
That's,
Yeah,
wow, almost half a
yeah,
century.
yeah. It's a long time. So, and the Gulf countries are very happy to deal with Modi because they see him as a uh, practical a man interested in the commercial success of both parties, and also in providing security, and vice versa. That's why I said the relationship between the UAE and increasingly with Saudi Arabia and India is extremely close. It's not a coincidence that the Saudis want to invest in Indian oil facilities, or the UAE wants to invest in an agricultural food park, or
Mm.
they propose that they do development in Kashmir. This is not coincidental. It doesn't just fall from the sky. There has to be political will on both sides for this to happen, and there is political will, and it is clear. Who else has? I mean, look at the honors that they have bestowed
The
on the
Prime
prime
Minister.
minister. The highest civilian medals, both in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, if I remember correctly. And I speak only of them. We have an extremely close relationship with Oman, with Kuwait, and of course with Bahrain. So our relationship with the Gulf is of critical strategic importance for us. At the same time, it's of critical commercial importance. I mean, they're interlaced, but I mean, essentially, this is a relationship that is only going in the right direction. And I have to say that in the last, between 2014 and today, it has grown by leaps and bounds. I mean, can you imagine a scenario that now a temple is being built
I was going to bring that up, yes.
in Abu Dhabi that is absolutely massive, massive thing between Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and it has the patronage of the ruler? You see, so the relationship is transcending the traditional approach of, which was primarily transactional. We send you our labor, they will remit,
Right.
we make our money, and then occasionally we have some security issues, we'll take care of it, blah blah blah. No, this is more than that. This is a relationship for the long haul. You might ask the question, why is this? Partly it's historical. Our relationship with the Gulf states has a millennial antiquity. We're not talking
Of
about
course,
centuries. Yeah,
that's true.
that's one thing. And the other thing is, I mean, even on a commercial scale, we have been engaging in commerce with the Gulf states for a long, long time.
Mm.
The pearls that they drove and picked up, some of it came to India.
Mm.
And the trading currency was rupees until they became UAE, and they were the crucial states until 1972, if my memory serves. They traded in the rupee. The rupee was the currency of day-to-day trade there, and then they changed it to dirham and so on. But you see, this is the sort of relationship that we have. Why not bring it back? Why not have that sort of close, integral, multifaceted, and dynamic relationship going forward? Because we are also a growing country. There's a tremendous opportunity for them in India, and vice versa. Our investments in the Gulf are growing incredibly, and thanks to a lot to the fact that there are so many of us working in these countries, so many Indians working in these countries, entirely peaceful, stable, non-troublemaking community. And who could ask for anything more than this as a growth, as in the growth engine almost, And the UAE appreciates it, for example, and Saudi Arabia appreciates it. They appreciate it. There's no mincing of words. I mean, let me point out to a unique situation here, which I remember. I think when Modi went to Saudi Arabia a few years ago, he visited I think it was a TCS, if memory serves.
I remember the women who lifted their veils
exactly,
take photographs with
and a lot of Saudi women who had just joined the employment force as Saudi Arabia was just transforming. A fantastic symbol, a fantastic signal. At the same time, we had at one of the annual festivals of Saudi Riyadh, I cannot remember the name. The chief guest was Sushma Swaraj, and she spoke. And in attendance was the king, the crown prince, and several other leading figures. I mean, the royal family. And all these are little symbols that Saudi Arabia gives. The Gulf states, they act very cautiously, very conservatively, and they show their trend and they show their inclination through little symbols, signals, and so on. And at least for the last decade, everything that I've been able to see there and I've observed is a positive. So our relationship with the Gulf in particular, which is of extremely important strategic value for us, is going in the right direction. There's no doubt about it. Of course, there will be efforts to undermine it, so on and so forth, by third parties, etc. Unlikely to work. I think India has over time shown the countries of the Gulf, and the Gulf countries have over time shown India that we can both be reliable partners to each other. This is not.
So you expect this to be more permanent?
Correct. They're working on a long-term, substantive, historic sort of ties, continuing as they used to be, from the perceptive point of view. How closely we were linked, and so on. Yeah, the rest of the Gulf Middle East countries, our relationships have improved again. I mean, our relationship with Egypt, for example, remember the wheat situation where they've come to, we become suppliers of wheat for them. And generally, the Middle Eastern people are very positively disposed towards India. The India story of the last couple of decades is highly regarded by people in the Middle East, because they see that a country which didn't have oil, it didn't have much in the way of natural resources for export and so on and so forth, has become a success. In fact, a global leader in many things now. We lead in many ways on the climate, on dealing with the climate change issue, on any number of things. Actually, on any issue of global substance today, of global impact, import, you can't do much without talking to India.
That's true, and good to understand that it's being recognized as such, because I think, again, the noise around this in mainstream media has come about a little late, so it might seem sudden to people without the context. But for the viewers, Jay is based out of Cyprus, but also out of the Middle East. So he has a lot of experience, decades of experience in the situation as it has evolved there. But also in Europe, you've lived
Correct.
there as well.
I've lived in.
You're a global citizen.
Kind of, yeah. I've lived in Europe. I'm actually. Cyprus is part of the European Union. I've lived in Africa for almost a decade. I've lived in the Middle East for a long time. And of course, my base is Cyprus.
Cyprus. Right. Okay, I think I have one more question. This is important because a recent statement discussed, that it's not oil that we are lacking, it's the refining capacity. And that's something that India has been working on pretty rapidly over the last, I think, couple of years. We've seen quite an increase in refining capacity, as well as we are looking at increasing strategic storage capacity, I think. So
Yes.
Do you have any insights on how that is progressing and what we can expect to see? What is the end game, so to speak, in this? Does India expect to have oil reserves that are significant? How would that help?
Okay, I'm not sure that I can offer you any insights on this, because I'm not an expert on either oil storage or refining. But the big picture is very clear. We are increasing our refining capacity. We are increasing our storage capacity, which we need, because we are we're consuming much more as every year goes by, and you cannot grow at 7 or 8% without consuming a lot of fossil fuel. And it's a fantasy to think that we are going to wean ourselves out of fossil fuel in the near future. So yes, the fact that we have the good thing is, Indian businessmen over the couple of decades, last several decades, in fact, have seen the value of having a processing capacity in India. So Reliance, it's a perfect example, which humongous refineries in Jamnagar and so on, which are proving today to be beneficial, because you can buy the Russian oil, refine it, and then sell it to Europe. Because then it's no longer a Russian product; it's from
Exactly.
India, and that's happening. And it's I mean, it is commerce at the end of the day. I mean, business is business, as we say, and this is it's all a good thing. I mean, this is the good thing about India's position right now. We are in a kind of sweet spot, in the sense that we don't have any major crises on our doorstep. I mean, we can talk about the Chinese in the north, and of course perennial nuisance of Pakistan on the west. But as I said, these are managed and manageable. These have been managed, and they are increasingly manageable. I don't think the Chinese are in a situation where they would like to provoke India at this point. I don't see that. There will be lots of news reports, this, that, and other thing. But let me say that although I don't see it, it could still happen. But I mean, our forces are ready; they are prepared, and the government is very much open about their view on the situation. And Galwan proved it. There's no backsliding on
Not
that
very
question.
pacifist view of living.
Yes, there's not a lot of pacifism left in India today. Let's put it like that, and that's a good thing, in my view. So yeah, I mean, we are in a sweet spot in the sense that we have excellent relationships with everybody. I mean, it was obvious. We have basically rubbished the sanctions regime. We are not paying much attention to it. At the same time, we were a guest at the G7, where it was obvious the relationship that Prime Minister has with global leaders, and their approach and view towards him as well. So that's a good thing. And we have a similar scenario with the BRICS countries, which is, includes Russia and China, which are quite antithetical now to the situation in the West. I mean, to the Americans and so on. In some ways, China has its own unique position, but in some ways, and of course with the rest of Asia. So we don't really have any, and of course excellent relationships with various countries in Africa too. So we are, in that sense, we have managed, in that sense, our external relationships at a strategic level very, I mean, exceptionally, I would say. Of course, there will always be little bits here, problems there, nagging issues here and there, but by and large, I mean, for the fact that coming out of the difficulties that we have come out of over the last 70 years of our independence, 75 years of our independence, I mean, it is something of a miracle that we are in the position that we are in. It shows to the fact that, at the core of decision making, even before the BJP government came to power, at the core of security decision making, at least, and foreign policy decision making, there has always been some amount of a good amount of sane adults guiding the process, in the sense of protecting and enhancing India's interest. Things have changed quite dramatically since, let's say, the late 90s, and particularly since 2014, because it has been a far more dynamic and to some extent muscular approach. I mean, Balakot, the strike into Myanmar, and also the strike into Pakistan are clear indications that India is no more a soft state that can be taken for granted, which it was, which is why we had the parliament attack. I mean, otherwise nobody would have considered that, even dreamt of doing something like this. Now they won't, because a reply is almost certain, and what the reply will be is very vague. So that's enough to deter. There is a much more deterrent capacity to India's posture now.
So, you mentioned historic remembrances in Russia, and how there are events and celebrations, and people remember the things that they've gone through, the harder times that they've gone through. Now, anecdotally, do you see this somewhat missing in India? Because we've had umpteen terror attacks, because I've grown up in the midst of that time when, we used to be cautioned by family every time we stepped out in metro cities, and those chain of bomb blasts in Guwahati, we've had terror attacks in Bombay, we've had the parliament attacks. So all of these things, do you see that, there's a lack of recognition of this in modern conscience or memory, in recent memory today, and people who have been relatively comfortable, for example, children who were probably in school at the time, today when they are entering the workforce, they have very little context of these issues, and thus they don't recognize how historic, perhaps, our geopolitical status today is?
Yeah, I think that, look, we could have done things much better in terms of what the children are taught, in terms of the history and all the rest of it. I mean, like you said, just to quickly point out, from 2014 onwards, the level of security that we've had in India, I cannot remember any previous 8-year period or 9-year period prior to that when we had so few bomb blasts, so few incidents of terror directly in India proper, including the union territories of Ladakh, Jammu, I mean, Kashmir, etc., etc. Okay, so it's never been the case. So that even now when it happens, even occasionally, we blow it out of proportion, having forgotten what it used to be like 15 years ago when it was literally a daily occurrence. People being killed in Kashmir was a daily occurrence. They may not remember it, but from 1989 to when after the Soviets withdrew out of Afghanistan, they just turned the people around and sent them over to our country, into Kashmir. And the period between 1989 and 1990 something was just a comprehensive disaster in terms of the situation, even in mainland India. I mean, even in other states of India. So, of course, we should have done things better. We should have more acknowledgement of the difficulties that we have gone through and overcome. We are beginning to see symbols and signals of it, and maybe there are more that I don't see because much of the time I'm outside the country. I mean, but we are beginning to see it. I mean, the new memorial for the forgotten soldier and all that. There's the sense that things are changing, and I think what is quote unquote called the new India is very much in tune with that. They're Indians in a different way than I feel Indian, or maybe even you feel Indian. The concept of India is slightly different. There's a more muscular, stronger, more economically powerful. Not an India that you need to make excuses for.
Yes.
Not an India that you need to give explanations for. But an India that is quite confident by itself, because we are a huge economy. We have a tremendous industrial base. We have confident businessmen all over the world, an extremely widespread and high-profile diaspora, and we are probably the fastest-growing economy in the world, large-size economy. We certainly are today. So there's a lot of good things. What we could nurture, as you said, is acknowledgement, remembrance, and come up with ways of committing to memory all these truths of the past 70 years, so that the good ones and the bad ones, that the history should be more as close to the objective truth as it can be, rather than the
opinions.
Yes, rather than what we had, let's say, over the first 50, 60, 70 years of our existence, which is basically much of the history that we were taught. Revisionist, mostly nonsense. I mean, even when you're reading it, you feel, I mean, this makes sense, if you have a slightly
but it's
thinking
not
mind.
about reading it.
Yeah, this is it. It's remembering it and acknowledging it, and just generally recognizing. I think this will happen as time goes by. I'm not one to actually push it down people's throat, but let it happen organically, city by city, village by village, state by state, so that people do this in a sort of organic way. And you see it happening. I mean, more and more when I look at images of India, I see, huge statues coming up, temples, tremendous temples coming up, old ones being refurbished. It's a function of money at the end of the day. But people are remembering their roots, acknowledging it, and being proud of it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, which unfortunately a certain segment of our population seem to think it is. And they have misidentified, mislabeled, and mischaracterized this group as quote unquote Hindutva, and they're paying a price for it politically.
I think this is a pretty large topic in itself. The whole idea that political prices don't seem to matter as much when there's even though we are a democracy, we are being decried as an electoral autocracy, and eventually the entire the core of democracy is being undermined by these mislabelings. But it's seen as something that's expedient to certain political players in the ecosystem as such.
Yes.
So, Well, it's been a very engaging conversation. Thank you so much for making the time today, Jay. I definitely look forward to having you on again soon. And thanks again for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sagarika, and I'm really glad this is the to have had our first podcast. And yes, of course, I look forward to it, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.